Welcome to the Rimworld DLC rundown. We'll be taking a quick look at what you can expect to see from Biotech. Hey folks, this is a small series of videos dedicated to breaking down individual Rimworld DLC. As Rimworld is a game that rarely goes on sale and the amount of DLC is ever growing, not everyone will be in the position to buy everything in one go. As such, you'll likely want to make sure that any DLC you do pick up will give you the content that you're really excited about and add the most value to your game. Biotech was the third DLC released for Rimworld, and includes pregnancy, children, genetic diversity and modding, known as xenogenes, a vampire race known as Sanguophages, the ability to control friendly mechanoids, the Mechanitor role, pollution mechanics, and a host of new supporting structures, factions, equipment, entities, and items to make these mechanics work. For a TLDR, Biotech is, at the time of recording, the Rimworld DLC. It not only adds the widest range of content and mechanics, it's also by far the most flexible, with its integration woven throughout the game so well that many of its features will work seamlessly with any colony idea. It'll improve the diversity of threats that you'll face, as well as massively broadening the scope of how you can decide to play a run. It is easily the first DLC to recommend to new players that only own the base game. This being said, the amount of mechanics that Biotech includes may be slightly overwhelming for a player that has only just started to play Rimworld. So as tempting as the starter bundle may be on the Steam page, you might want to do a few normal runs with Biotech disabled to get a handle on mechanics, like food, temperature, and combat, before you throw in all the additional variables that Biotech can add. So off to a pretty good start. One of Biotech's biggest strengths is that the new content that it adds in isn't all tied together in just one system. You can either enable or disable children, choose to engage with the Mechanitor content or not, allow diverse xeno-human factions to spawn at world generation, or limit what xenotypes you're likely to see. You can entirely ignore recruiting certain xeno-humans if they don't match your colony's playstyle or the overall vision. You could exclusively recruit one race because of how specifically you're building your colony, and all of these options can be combined in various different ways to result in a dramatically different colony. I'd go as far as to say that this adds in more diversity of playstyle than ideology, which is a DLC that was specifically designed to mix up how you play a colony. We've got quite a few big, involved mechanics to cover with this DLC, so let's start with genetics, as that has the furthest reach of interaction. We're going to have to start with a terminology breakdown really quickly, as much like ideology, Biotech's genetics can be a little overwhelming to look at initially because of the amount of new concepts it's going to throw at you. Xenotype is a word used to define the genetic makeup of a human. Standard Rimworld pawns are known as a baseliner. Genes are what makes up a specific xenotype, so baseliners only have genes for skin and hair colour, whereas something more involved, like a pigskin, will have genes that impact stats and gameplay mechanics. This then leads into complexity, which defines how difficult and involved it will be to artificially construct a xenotype in-game. Finally, you've got metabolic efficiency. The par for this is 0. Negative values in efficiency will increase a pawn's hunger rate, positive values will decrease it. Generally speaking, genes that have a beneficial gameplay effect, so in this instance something like strong immunity, are going to cost metabolic efficiency because it's providing a bonus. Equally, genes that are a negative, like poor cooking, will offset this metabolic efficiency cost. So for most xenotypes, they will have to have both strengths and weaknesses to try and balance out this number. The next part of this menu to notice is the difference between what is known as a germline gene and a xenogene. Germline genes are in the top section. These can't be modified and may be passed on to any children that the pawn has. Xenogenes are in the lower section. These aren't passed on to children and can be edited through gene modification. If a xenogene would clash with a germline gene, the xenogene will then take priority, such as applying great cooking to a pigskin. Applying a new xenogene to a pawn will completely overwrite their existing xenogenes. Think of them like a USB with genetic data. You have to remove the old one, losing access to all of its files, in order to install a new one. There is also the small matter of massive metabolic swings when applying a new xenogene to a pawn. If you're turning a negative skill into a positive one, for example, not only will you be losing the helpful effect on metabolic efficiency from the poor skill, you'll likely be applying a harmful effect onto it from the positive, with positive skills typically costing more in metabolic efficiency than the negatives offset at the same level. This usually means for an impactful positive gene, let's say great shooting, you would have to take a negative of equal impact and another negative. In this case, awful melee and weak melee damage, which balances out metabolic efficiency for a nice round 0.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Why do you need to keep this number around 0 anyway? Metabolic efficiency can go into the positives as much as you'd like, with the bonus to hunger rate capping at +5, making it 50%, but you're unable to go beyond -5 in metabolic efficiency, which is 225% hunger rate. It's why you want to plan out what germline genes might be changed when applying a xenogene, as hitting that -5 is very easy to do if you aren't careful. I hope that makes some sort of sense. Xenogenetics are one of those mechanics that it's typically easier to understand when you actually get your own hands on it and you can have a quick mess around. So let's cover the xenohumans then. We've already mentioned baseliners, so what else is there? I won't be breaking down every individual gene that's included in Biotech. We'd be here all day if I did. So hopefully a quick bit of back-to-back between the xenohumans should give you an idea of what impacts you can expect to see in-game. You have Dirtmoles, people that have adapted to live in the dark places of the earth. Boasting fast wound healing, throwing hard-hitting blows with melee weapons and mining picks alike, these folk can happily live in the dark without penalty. Unfortunately, they're a little slower than usual. Their eyes aren't well adjusted for longer distances and they absolutely hate the sunlight.
I'd say it's pretty good.
Next up are Genies, which you'll notice are a xenogene race. This means if you apply a new xenogene to a Genie, you essentially completely rewrite them, as underneath they're a normal baseliner. Genies are thinkers and tinkers, very capable with their hands when it comes to anything but violence, as they'll fall apart faster than IKEA furniture that was built in a student flat. They're at least smart enough to know their own limits though, never starting violence in the colony if they have a mental break. Unfortunately, they're bad at interacting with any other living thing, especially humans. They've spent so long at the research bench doom-scrolling memes that they don't actually interact with people anymore. They say lol out loud, and answer questions with, oh wait, I've got the perfect gif for this. The Hussar is next, and they're the jock to your Genie's nerd. Working on a xenogene too, they're a drug-dependent super soldier. They heal quickly, can't be affected by psychic phenomena, can withstand temperatures and even some toxins, and they'll shrug off bullets as they charge into combat and have a proficiency with both ranged and melee weapons. The downside to all of this? They frequently get into fights around the base, they're awful at most job types, and they have a gene for a chemical dependency. This is the first type of gene we've encountered for this. A dependency can be great, because it removes the risk of the associated addiction on that pawn, so Hussars can use as much go juice as they want without risking the addiction malus. This doesn't stop them from overdosing though, so maybe don't inject 20 doses back to back. The main drawback of a dependency is that you will always need some go juice on hand to keep these pawns happy. After 5 days, they start to develop a deficiency and see a pretty significant dent in their core stats.
So I've decided to go back on it. I'm taking testosterone. I'm also doing a growth hormone.
After 30 days without a hit, they'll drop into a coma. If you leave them for an entire year without a fix, they'll simply perish. So drug dependencies have good and bad parts. Good that you'll be able to use the associated drug with much less risk. Bad that you will have to use the drug on a semi-regular basis, and produce or procure it to be able to keep the pawns happy in your colony. Now we've got the Neanderthal. When they aren't listening to a Joe Rogan podcast on the comms console, you'll typically find them cracking skulls and shrugging off all but the most serious damage. With a strong immunity, better temperature tolerance, increased melee damage, reduced incoming damage and pain, Neanderthals fit a more natural approach towards a smashy super soldier. They're a little slow, both mentally and physically, which sees them solving problems with social fights more often than not, but they can't be beat for a nice cheap meat shield. The Pigskin, despite its appearance, isn't that far removed from a baseliner. They have a good immune system and a decent tolerance for pain, as well as an immunity to food poisoning and a bonus for eating raw food, with it providing far more nutrition. This is offset by their trotter hands being absolutely awful for manipulation, especially detrimental to their ranged combat ability as they're also nearsighted, so they can't aim or see for shit. As they're so used to eating raw food, they make pretty bad cooks too. Next up is the Impid, and let's quickly talk cosmetics with this race. You'll notice that imps have multiple potential skin tones and hair colours, with some of them being greyed out. For races that feature genes like this, it's typically used to limit what colours they'll be generated with, while still giving them a range of potential options to roll on. Imps will live up to their name, blazing fast across the battlefield and spitting fire in combat. Unfortunately, whilst they're impressive shock troopers, they have a weak immunity, they heal slowly, and swing swords like pool noodles. As you'd expect from such a fiery race, they are resistant to flame, very tolerant of hotter climates, but they're a bit weak to cold. And they're also just kinda miserable. Pfft, millennials. Due to their propensity for burning things, they lack some skills with plants and animals. They make for good ranged fighters that can break attackers who approach them in melee by immolating them, and then moving back to create a little more distance. The Waster, my favourite little crackhead. Easily the xenotype I got the most fun out of with unmodded Biotech. They're totally immune to toxic, have a really good immunity, and absolutely thrive living in a polluted area, giving you access to all kinds of weird and wonderful new colony approaches. Much like the Hussar, Wasters have drug inclinations, with a dependency on Psychite and an immunity to the negative effects of Wake Up. So you'll want Psychite Tea, Flake, or Yayo around to keep them at their most active, set on a 5-day schedule. Most likely with a spare bump or two in their backpack for any combat encounters to make sure their buffs are active. Their impervious to Wake Up allows them to take the drug, gaining all of its stat benefits with no risk of an overdose or an addiction. So a late game Waster colony will typically see them pounding pills and snorting lines before charging into combat absolutely bathed in pollution and filth. You'll need these buffs to offset their negatives though, as Wasters are aggressive and unattractive, spending most of their time on 4chan or arguing about how good Stellar Blade is on Twitter. They're bad cooks, bad artists, and awful with animals. Their poor cooking feeds into them producing harder Psychite drugs as well, as they're far less likely to have the skill requirements necessary to make Psychite tea. Now you've got the Yttakin, furry boys. They're pretty savage melee combatants with a unique animal war call, which sees them recruiting nearby wildlife to fight alongside them temporarily. This ability varies dramatically in its usefulness based on the biome that you're living in. Being able to throw bears at an enemy is awesome, but sending lizards or a tortoise at them is somewhat underwhelming. You can exploit the crap out of this mechanic too, as friendly manhunter animals with the Warcry effect don't retaliate if you attack them. So when those Thrumbo wander onto your tile, pop this on them and beat them to death with clubs. You'll get free horns, leather, and meat. Like most melee combatants, Yttakin have stronger damage and take less damage, whilst being a bit more aggressive. They can also shrug off psychic effects somewhat. Unfortunately, they'll heal slower than most, so they're going to spend more time in bed after a scrap, which they will enjoy given that they're sleepier than normal and love a good rest. The other strange part of Yttakin is their naked speed. They don't mind nudity because of their fur skin, and it gives them huge temperature tolerances, so if they're undressed, they'll move a bit faster, not being constrained by clothing. If they're wearing anything though, they'll suffer a move speed penalty. The question is, do you value that 0.2 move speed buff over the ability to not be turned into a red mist while charging at an enemy? As you'd expect with these guys, they're good with animals. They don't get along with mining though, preferring open fields. Next up is the Highmate, another xenogene race that was created to be a perfect companion. Sporting a range of cosmetics like the Imp, Highmates will stand out when you see them. The biggest thing of note with the Highmate is that they are totally incapable of violence genetically. Being fragile if a firefight even breaks out around them, they're far better suited to duck and cover. To make up for this, they're beautiful, happy, frisky, kind, and very good socialites. Other pawns will fall over themselves trying to get the attention of a Highmate, and for good reason. Highmates flirting will always succeed, and their first partner will gain a significant buff with a psychic bond. This will work as long as the Highmate and their other half aren't separated, by distance or, death. As you'd expect, this race is pretty useless with work. They're terrible with mining and plants, but they are perfect socializers. Just don't expect them to put down a prison uprising. They're also psychically sensitive, so make for good supporting casters if you're using royalty. And finally we have the Sanguophage, or the Rimworld take on a vampire. This xenogene has something known as Archite genes, which cost Archite capsules to use. Typically this means if you're making your own xenogenes in game, you will have to use an item called an Archite capsule to install these extremely powerful genes. They're overpowered by design because of this cost. So what do we got? The gene implanter allows a Sanguophage to overwrite the xenogenes of another pawn with a copy of their own. Now, remember that some xenotypes use germline genes and others use a xenotype. This means that you can stack a Sanguophage on top of other types, like a Yttakin Sanguophage, which will massively offset some of the original germline's negatives, while posing its own new set of risks because of the Sanguophage's weaknesses. Ageless is the next Archite gene, and it sees the pawn simply stop aging once they've hit 18 years old. Deathless is almost invulnerability of sorts. A Sanguophage can still be killed if their brain is destroyed, and what you'll find when facing Sanguophages is that your own pawns tend to destroy their brain far more often than with other enemies, because the game is automatically splattering the Sanguophages when they fall over, so you don't have an easy time capturing them, thanks to the death on down chance. As long as a Sanguophage's brain isn't destroyed, they'll slowly regenerate missing essential parts and cannot die from blood loss. Non-senescent plays alongside Ageless. If you have a pawn that was already old when they became a Sanguophage, this gene will stop them getting age-related health problems, like a bad back, dementia, or suffering from heart attacks. Archite metabolism is a huge positive hit to metabolic efficiency, used to further offset just how strong a Sanguophage is. Perfect immunity goes even further than just having a good immunity that other pawns may have, making a Sanguophage instead unable to be affected by any illnesses or infections. Scarless is useful if you turned a pawn into a Sanguophage who may have already been a little bruised and battered, removing old scars every 1 or 2 quadrums, making sure that Sanguophages are always in peak condition. So that's all of the insanely beneficial positives. What else do they have? As you'd likely expect from a vampiric type, they have genes related to blood use. Hemogenic is the supporting gene for this system, as other genes that try and use the hemogen system will not function without it. Hemogenic pawns need to consume blood on a semi-regular basis, which is where the new item of a blood pack comes in. It can be used to perform transfusions on pawns that have blood loss after combat, or can be used to feed hemogenic pawns when their supply is getting a little low. Hemogenic Drain is given to Sanguophages, which is a large boost to metabolic efficiency at the cost of a higher hemogenic drain per day. This means that a Sanguophage will typically need to drink blood every 2 days to remain at an even level, if they aren't using any abilities, that is. Blood Feeder is another gene that allows Sanguophages to feed directly from other pawns by biting them, cutting out the middleman of needing to perform hemogen collections. Coagulate is the first real skill that Sanguophages will have access to. With such a strong understanding and control over blood, Sanguophages are able to tend others' wounds simply by laying a hand upon them. Expending some of their own hemogen supply in the process, this is very useful to instantly stop dangerous bleeds or overwhelming amounts of small cuts on a pawn. Next, they're able to spend hemogen to leap extreme distances to get in or out of combat. This is great for baiting enemies over slow terrain like rivers or marshes, before hopping back over and forcing them to turn around and have to traverse it again. The piercing spine costs hemogen to use, but it's devastatingly effective. Sanguophages grow a rack of keratin spines inside their upper chest, which can be fired out for significant sharp damage at will, allowing Sanguophages to reliably snipe important targets in the middle of a brawl. Finally, Sanguophages have Deathrest, which pumps even more metabolic efficiency into their body. This creates the need for Deathrest, which is a specific type of long, uninterrupted sleep.
Just 5 more minutes. Is it 13:58 yet?
No.
Then fuck off.
Sanguophages that are quote-unquote killed are put into an involuntary death rest to recover, and those that ignore the need for death rest will experience severe stat penalties. Death rest will typically need to be performed every 30 days or so, and without any bonuses, takes 4 days to complete. If the death rest process is interrupted, the pawn will experience a consciousness, movement, and manipulation debuff for around 5 days. So that's all of the Archite and Hemogenic genes. Now we've got some normal ones too. Sanguophages have super fast wound healing, increased psychic sensitivity, faster movement, toxic immunity, strong melee damage, a lower need for sleep, they take less damage, a beauty bonus, the ability to see in the dark, and increased melee, social, and intellectual skills. So just a few buffs. To offset this, they're a little sensitive to the sun, although less so than a Dirtmole. They also not only fear fire and run from the sight of it, but take 400% more damage from it. Like any xenotype that seems to get a melee damage bonus, they're aggressive too. These weaknesses make imps a cheap and extremely impactful counter to Sanguophages. They're able to bathe areas in flame with their breath attack, causing Sanguophages to either turn tail and run, or stand their ground and be cooked in a matter of seconds. So ideally, if you're using a Sanguophage, check what enemies you're about to clash with. 400% extra damage is no joke. So whilst we're here, let's quickly cover the new structures associated with Deathrest, as they're pretty relevant to the Sanguophage specifically. Whilst any bed can be used for Deathrest, investing in Deathrest research and using the associated buildings will provide buffs and benefits to the process. A Deathrest casket requires a small amount of electricity while in use and will boost the Deathrest progress speed by 1.1 times, allowing your Sanguophages to be back on their feet just that little bit faster. The casket isn't the only structure you'll have unlocked with this research though. You'll also have a wedge of additional buildings that can be connected to the casket to provide a boost to Deathrest, or a lasting buff for the pawn upon Deathrest completion. There's the Deathrest Accelerator, which uses a whacking 800 watts of power. Up to 2 accelerators can be connected to a casket and each increases the progress rates by 1.2 times. So a normal bed will take around 4 days, but a casket with 2 accelerators cuts it down to 2.5. A good chunk of time saved. The glucosoid pump is next, and it costs less power to run, but it needs to be fueled with hemogen packs whilst a pawn is in the connected casket and death resting. Up to 4 of these can be connected, with each applying a stack of the glucosoid rush buff, which will last until the pawn's next death rest. Each stack of this buff adds an extra 12% movement speed, so 24, 36 and up to 48 at the cap. It's a pretty solid buff to have for almost 30 days. You just need to make sure you've got a few donors providing hemogen to keep multiples of these machines topped up. Next up is the hemogen amplifier, which like the glucosoid pump, doesn't use that much power but consumes hemogen whilst in use. There's no limit on how many hemogen amplifiers you can connect. The restriction is more around floor space. A hemogen amplifier increases the amount of hemogen gain by 25%, stacking the buff too. There's a sweet spot here of using 2 amplifiers, as the cost of fueling the buildings to apply this buff during death rest will be offsetting how much hemogen you're saving while the Sanguophage is awake. Going above 2 amplifiers starts to diminish these savings. Going above 5 amplifiers actually means you're consuming more hemogen to fuel the machines than you're saving on the Sanguophage. So maybe don't look at the no limit thing and go too crazy.
Shut up, nerd!
Now we've got the Hemopump. Like the 2 before it, this uses low power but consumes hemogen to apply its buff. For every Hemopump connected, the Sanguophage's hemogen pool is increased by 25 units, so they're able to store more for rapid fire use of abilities. This does absolutely nothing to increase how much hemogen is restored from all sources though, as they work on flat amounts, not percentage restoration. A psychofluid pump is one of the more niche buildings, and also one of the more expensive. Working like hemo buildings, this needs to be fueled with packs to support its buff. This has a limit of 4 connected per Deathrest casket, with each one applying a stack of the Psycho Fluid Rush buff that increases psychic sensitivity by 25%, neural heat recovery by 0.05, and improves meditation psi focus gain by 5%. If you've gone the route of making your Sanguophage a psi caster through royalty, this can make some of their casts astronomically powerful, as the Sanguophage itself is already a psychically gifted race. It can make certain effects that scale in duration last for entire encounters, like Berserk Pulse sticking on targets for long enough that the entire raid will defeat itself. But if all of these buildings sound too powerful for you, now's the time that I mention there's a limit to how many of these a Sanguophage can connect with.
Oh man, there's always a catch!
All fresh Sanguophages have something known as a Deathrest capacity, and it'll be set to 1. You'll need something called a Deathrest capacity serum to increase this number, with a bonus of 1 per serum. This allows Sanguophages to connect more buildings to their Deathrest casket. As a general rule, you're going to want any Sanguophages in your colony to have 2 capacity minimum, so that they can use 2 Deathrest accelerators. These provide the biggest bonus. Next, you're most likely wanting to prioritise the glucosoid pumps for the move speed bonus, or if you have a potent Psycaster and resources to burn, Psychofluid pumps. There is unfortunately very little argument to be made for using hemopumps or amplifiers. I guess if you've got one god tier Sanguophage and you're not sharing their power, you might as well use any serums you can find and keep adding the extra buffs on. But for non-casters, 6 is a solid max, with a Psycasting Sanguophage able to make use of 10 Deathrest capacity slots. And that's all the xenotypes that Biotech includes, but not all of the genes, which opens up all kinds of possibilities for you to make your own custom xenotypes when selecting pawns before the start of the game, or to play around with gene modding whilst in-game to make your own xenogerms, which will change people's xenotypes. A lot of the word xeno in here all blurs into one. So before we move into another section, let's cover gene modding. Researching xenogenetics would unlock the Gene Assembler, Gene Extractor, and Gene Bank, as well as the ability to make xenogerms in the assembler. You'll want to use an extractor to get an item known as a gene pack, then use a bank to store it, and then the assembler can turn the information in those connected banks into a xenogerm of your own. This can then be installed into a pawn. Just a few steps there, eh? Let's cover some housekeeping around this first. Extracting a pawn's genes can be done on both friendly pawns and prisoners, so at times you may wish to capture enemies purely to borrow their genes for your own uses. The procedure isn't exactly damaging, but it does leave the target a little woozy for a couple of days afterwards. It causes a small amount of pain, it lowers their consciousness, and it impacts their blood filtration. So be careful not to extract a pawn's genes while they're ill, you'll wreck their immunity gain rate. A pawn will also be hit with the health condition of genes regrowing after this procedure, which by itself has no negative impact. However, if you try to extract genes from a pawn with this condition, it'll kill them. Yes, even if they have the Deathless gene, because this process destroys the brain. So it's best to wait for it to pass. It takes around 20 days at most. Once a pawn's genes are extracted, you'll see that the gene pack item is dropped on the floor near the extractor machine. It will have between 1 and 4 of the pawn's genes in a little bundle, with the ideal outcome being a single, isolated gene. These gene packs will deteriorate regardless of if they're in a roofed stockpile, as long as they are outside of a gene bank. They take 20 days to fully deteriorate, but will have their condition restored once placed inside a gene bank, allowing you to safely transport them again if needed. Gene packs can also be found on traders or earned as quest rewards, which will likely be a way that you find the more elusive genes, like Acid Spray or Never Sleep, as these aren't included in any of the default xenotypes that the game has, so they won't be harvested. Gene banks will hold up to 4 of these gene packs, regardless of how many genes the pack has itself. So 4 packs with 1 gene will take up as many slots as 4 packs with 4 genes. So now that we've got some genes in the bank, we can use the assembler to make our own xenogerm. You can see the complexity limit as well as the impact the gene modification will have on the target's metabolism. Remember that -5 is the biggest impact possible on metabolism, so if a pawn is already at -2 with their germline and you try to apply a xenogene that is -4, it won't be possible. By that same token, if they're at -2 and one of the gene overlaps somewhat, so you're changing strong melee to great melee, it'll only actually cost the pawn -2, as they've already paid the -1 for the strong gene. You're just ramping it up a little. I know this is a lot of math and none of us are here for that, but I've made countless xenogerms over my playtime and forgotten what the actual impact on the pawn would be, meaning I've had to make it again, only a little bit less ambitiously. You can also probably see from this why you want individual genes too. With such a limited metabolic range and gene complexity to play with, you want to be able to craft genes exactly as you'd like them, without needing to take potentially meaningless additional genes that are stuck in a pack together. So, all of this now leads to a xenogerm, the implant device that replaces the target's xenogenes with the ones included inside it. Once installed, the pawn will be in a brief coma while their body adjusts to the genetic shock, and they'll be given an extremely long-lasting version of the gene's regrowing effect, meaning if you place them into an extractor machine, they'll die. This doesn't stop you installing another xenogerm though, so if you make a mistake with your creation, you aren't locked into it for over a year. You can make another and try again. There are a few other parts around genetic modification. You have the research of a gene processor, which unlocks an additional building of the same name, with each one connected increasing potential complexity by 2, which allows you to make more specialised xenogerms. The next bit of research is archogenetics, which allows you to make use of any of the archite genes you have in your banks by spending archite capsules when making a xenogerm. These rare items typically appear on traders or as quest rewards. As capsules are required to make xenogerms that use these powerful genes, you want to make really sure you've got everything right before hitting the start combining button. And that is genes. Just one part of biotech. Let's go into what it plays into the most: children. You have a whole host of new items in biotech designed to help you raising kids. There's a few new bits of research, some medical procedures, there's some new options to play with if you want to edit a custom storyteller too. If you've got to this part of the video and thought, ugh, kids, you can disable them entirely in the storyteller settings so you don't need to deal with them. You've also got the option of changing how fast children grow up. By default, they age at a 400% increased rate. Alright, some of the settings covered, now onto the birds and the bees. When a mommy pawn and a daddy pawn love each other very, very much, they won't have a kid because you don't get pregnant by doing it the way that they are. Pawns that are in a relationship will have an option in the social tab as to how they'd like to go about bumping uglies. They can stick with normal for a standard pregnancy chance, actively try to get a baby with a 400% increase, or test their pull-out game and lower the chance to 25%, Bagsy no sleeping on the wet spot. The parent's germline genes will be taken into consideration when having a child. Genes shared by both parents will always be passed down. Genes only possessed by one parent may or may not be inherited. Xenogenes, as I mentioned earlier, will never be passed down to a child. Fertility rates are also going to play into pregnancy chances too, with older pawns losing fertility as time goes on and some pawns just straight up being sterilised. Au naturel isn't the only option though. With the research of fertility procedures, you are able to make test tube babies, turkey-based are not included. These procedures allow you to extract an ovum for IVF from a fertile female pawn before having a male pawn fertilise it to produce an embryo. This embryo can then be implanted into a female pawn for her to carry the pregnancy, or used with another new research for biotech, growth fats, which can gestate the embryo instead, working twice as fast as a traditional pregnancy. So why go the route of tech over good old-fashioned bun in the oven? Pregnancy takes its toll on a mother, with stacking debuffs as they progress through trimesters. At first trimester, they're a little more hungry. At second, they move slower and lose some manipulation, whilst getting hungry 30% faster. In the third trimester, they'll move at half speed, struggle to work and have a 50% hunger rate offset, spending most of their day eating or walking to get something to eat. This isn't the only potential downside either. Expectant mothers can also have mood swings, going anywhere from -14 to +8, as well as occasionally being hit with morning sickness, which will see them barfing all around the base, whilst suffering lower movement, manipulation, and consciousness. And content warning for anyone who potentially has trauma around childbirth. Mothers can miscarry in Rimworld. Poor health always runs the risk of this happening, such as malnutrition, particularly savage illnesses, or if you've been a complete bellend, wounds from combat and the subsequent blood loss or injuries. So let's say the mother made it all the way to the end of their 3rd trimester. Hooray! You're not out of the woods yet. You want to make sure that you've got a good medical bed in place and a skilled doctor for the delivery of your child. During labour, the mother will go through 3 stages of dilation, which gradually lowers movement and increases the pain they experience, before progressing to the pushing stage. Whilst attending the childbirth, you have a few boxes to tick to ensure the birth quality is offset in your favour as much as possible. The age of the mother is used to determine the initial bonus, with between 20 and 30 years old offering the highest percentage of 50. The attending doctor's medical skill, which increases percentage by 1.25 for every level they have. There's the cleanliness of the room, with a fully sterile room giving an additional 10% chance. A loved one being present increases the outcome by 5%. The procedure being indoors increases the outcome by 5%. The bed's birth quality offset improves the bonus by up to 5%, with a hospital bed of even normal quality providing this. A baby born in a growth vat has a birth quality of 70%, so you've got an extra potential 30% to play with by going the au natural route. This quality is determined when the baby is born, not at the start of proceedings. So if the room has grown dirty, or if the doctor had a mental break and wandered off to go and punch a prisoner, this is going to impact the outcome significantly. There are 3 possible outcomes for the baby, and there is almost always a risk for the mother. The baby could be stillborn, sick, or perfectly healthy. Even at 100% birth quality, there is always the risk of a bad outcome. If this is something that's traumatic for you as a player to deal with, there is an option in the custom storyteller settings to make sure that children are always born healthy. Apologies if going through this section wasn't exactly the most enjoyable for you. Babies that are born sick can either have a mild, common, bad, or grave severity to their illness. The disease is resolved once the baby develops immunity, or if you can successfully bring the severity down to 0%, this cures it. The baby will take 10 days to develop an immunity naturally to the illness, and a 100% tend will slow the progression by 0.35 severity, meaning this completely offsets mild, common, and bad illnesses. This is why a grave illness is so risky. Even with a perfect normal medicine tend, it isn't going to offset in severity. Instead, it gains in 0.15 per day, meaning it will hit completion before the immunity does. You'll need a doctor to consistently hit 130% tens using Glitter World meds to fight off a grave infant illness. Of course, the baby might just be born healthy, and it's all good. Now, as for the mother, she will always be safe if the quality was over 90%, but there is a not insignificant chance that below that she may not make it, with the biggest risk falling between 0 and 20% birth quality. At 0%, there is a 20% chance that the mother will die during childbirth. This falls to a 6% chance of death if you can raise it to even 20% quality, so making a small effort with birth preparation will make a big difference. So let's say mum survived and so did the baby. You get to name the little one and the mother gets a lovely dose of postpartum exhaustion, given that she just pushed a watermelon out of her hoo-ha. She'll now be capable of breastfeeding her child, but if you'd rather the whole colony pitches in to look after the little one, you can make some baby food at a stove by smashing up some veggies, or feed them directly with animal milk or insect jelly. Whilst the mother is lactating, it dramatically lowers her chances of becoming pregnant again. She will need to make sure she's eating enough food during this time though, to make sure that enough milk is being produced for the baby. Mothers can wet nurse each other's children, so if you have multiple births around the same time, they can all help, with any mothers that stop breastfeeding losing this lactation effect after 10 days of inactivity. You gotta use it or lose it, sister. The other option you now have is throwing this baby into a growth vat whilst it's still teeny tiny. So whilst you have the option of putting an embryo directly into the vat, a natural pregnancy will need to reach this stage before being put into the tank. The growth vat will take care of all the baby's needs, providing you put nutrition into the tank, similarly to a biosculptor pod from Ideology. The main risk with these pods is if you have a power cut, be it from a solar flare or someone breaking your power grid. The pawn inside will start the process of biostarvation. This biostarvation rises by 50% per day when disconnected from power, and will lower by 10% for each day that power has been resupplied. So frequent, intermittent power cuts can be extremely harmful to a tank baby, with only 2 days of interruption needed to prove fatal. The biggest bonus of using a growth vat is the massively accelerated speed that it progresses a baby to their next stage of life. Babies outside of vats aren't there to just scream and demand food though. You've got until they hit age 3 to enjoy the time spent with them, as they daydream in their crib, have playtime with their parents or childminders, giggle and cheer up any pawns around them, or scream and make their parents miss the old days, walking around the base at 2 AM with a cup of coffee, wondering how far they could drive before someone would notice they were missing. To help with looking after a child, you'll likely want a crib, a toy box, a baby decoration, and a seat, near to the parent's bedroom, if not inside of it. This will give the parents somewhere to sit whilst playing with or feeding the baby, as well as increasing the speed that the baby gains recreation during playtime. Once babies grow up to children, either naturally or via pod accelerated growth, they'll be ready to start learning and helping around the colony. Ideally, you don't want kids working. Not just because they do a really bad job of it and make subpar t-shirts, but because more time spent learning is going to make for better pawns when they hit their teens. You can have a child soldier army if you really wanted to, with them able to wield weapons as soon as they can walk. Just remember that their teeny tiny limbs only have teeny tiny health pools, so a shot to the arm from a revolver might hurt an adult, but they'll live. That same shot could straight up take off a child's arm and just wreck them going forwards.
Check your shots.
Children will develop between the ages of 3 and 13, but this doesn't mean that you have 10 in-game years to try and make an impact. By default, it's 400% speed, remember? This means you've got 2.5 years to try and not get this kid killed, and it's life on the rim, so that's next to impossible. Between the ages of 13 and 18, pawns will still have slightly weaker limbs, as they are still growing, so make sure to keep them safe during combat through those years. So, let's get these kids set up. Firstly, you're going to want some clothes for them, because nobody needs to see that running around the base. Kids have their own specific clothing, pants, shirts, parkas, a romper, tribal wear, kid helmet, but they can also wear the majority of adult helmets too, as well as a shield belt, which is surprisingly useful if you take your eye off the ball and somehow they end up running through the middle of an active war zone. Having a shield belt to prevent stray bullets is quite literally a lifesaver for them. Now that you've assigned them some clothes and hopefully remembered to put them on a different drug policy so you don't have kids getting wasted on beers or smoking joints around the base.
Stewie, I told you there's alcohol in that. It's not for kids.
You're not for kids.
It's time for them to get learning. To make sure that they're doing this as often as possible, you want all of their waking hours to be scheduled to recreation. Children can learn by drawing on the floor, being taught lessons at a school desk by an adult, with this learning type being boosted by placing up to 3 blackboards near the desk, improving the impact by 60% at max. Children could go running in nature, or sit and daydream looking at the sky. They're able to interact with others by chatting on the radio, they can read books, and finally they can observe your other pawns at work. All of these activities will have a positive impact on their learning percentage. The higher the child's learning percentage, the more progress they make on their growth tier every day. This is the part that matters for children. They'll have what's known as growth moments at ages 7, 10 and 13. So you're given a bit of a buffer before their first moment, with it taking 4 years versus the 3 for the other 2 moments. This is because all children will start off with 50% learning at age 3, but they retain their learning percentage after hitting their growth moments. So when you're going from 7 to 10, hopefully you're starting from a higher percentage, meaning growth will be much faster from the outset. These growth moments offer you choices. The better you've done raising the child, the more choices you're offered. The best tier of growth you can hit is 8, which requires an average learning percentage of around 90 or more for the child's entire upbringing. This is no easy task. To quickly break down these tiers, at 0 you get 1 trait with no option. At tier 1 you can choose 1 trait from 2 options. Tier 2 offers 1 trait choice from a potential 3. Tier 3 is 1 trait choice from a potential 4. Tier 4 keeps the same 1 trait from 4 but now grants you a passion as well. Tier 5 is the same on traits with 1 passion from 2 choices. Tier 6, same on traits, 1 passion, 3 choices. Tier 7, same on traits, 2 passion from 4 choices. And finally, Tier 8 is 1 trait choice from 6 options and 3 passion choices from 6 options. I'm pretty sure it's clear as to why you want to focus so heavily on hitting high learning for these better growth tiers. More passions, better trait choices. If you hit all 3 of these growth moments with the best possible outcome, you've picked 3 traits from a possible 18 with 9 potential passions, depending if you wanted to split single passions over multiple skills, or if you went for burning passions on specific instead. As children grow, they also unlock new work types. At age 3, they'll only be able to take care of their own needs, haul and clean. From age 7, they can help with firefighting, animal handling, cooking, hunting, planting, mining, tailoring and crafting. At age 10, they can start to learn medicine, even be a warden, they can build and they can do art. Finally, at age 13, they can start working at the smithy and researching. All of these skills are also learnable from these ages, even if they aren't actively working on them. Lessons taught in a classroom will grant them experience towards these skills, as will watching other pawns work around the colony. From age 13 onwards, they're children no more, now able to wear adult clothing and functioning like a normal colonist. Now is the time to mention growth fats and their potential applications for children and teens. Whilst you can skip almost all of the time needed to raise a child by keeping them in a growth fat, you typically end up with a bit of a drip. They'll be lacking in passions, stuck with whatever traits the game threw at them. They're kinda useless. They're alright for hauling and cleaning, but not a lot else. The default aging rate of a child being 400% means that a growth vat is instead 2000%. Or if you're using ideology with a preset for growth vats, it's actually 2600%. So suddenly that 2.5 years in game is now half a year, or less, for a fully grown colonist. The more useful part of the growth vats is accelerating through dangerous parts. So you'll likely want to raise your kids through the growth moments, but then skip the stage where they're 13 to 18, whilst their body is still growing but they've done all their actual learning. Getting those last 5 years quickly finished to remove their weak body parts and bring their global work speed up to cap is really useful. And I think that's it for kids. For all of you wondering, yes, their organs count exactly the same as adults, you monster. Okay, another section then. The Mechanitor. Not like this is a friggin' massive topic to cover or anything. Quick side note, I've always pronounced the word as Mechanitor. When I streamed the game, I said Mechanitor. When I watched other people's streams, they said Mechanitor. After recording all of this voiceover, I only notice now that it's Mechanitor. My incorrect pronunciation of this word is so firmly embedded in my brain that at this point it's impossible to say it right without making a conscious effort. If this video somehow embeds the incorrect way of saying it into your head too, you're welcome. If you've always said it the way that I do in this video, congrats, you're a brainlet too. So what is a Mechanitor? They're a pawn that has control over mechanoids, allowing you to have friendly robots that help you work around your colony or support you in combat and take the brunt of an assault, keeping your squishy colonists safe and sound. To get one yourself, you have a few options. There's a scenario included with Biotech that sets you up with a Mechanitor, some starting mechs and the tech to build their supporting infrastructure. If you'd rather play a different start but still get one in your colony, you'll need to search your map for a wreckage called the Ancient Exostrider midsection. Destroying this will drop some steel scrap and an item called a Mechanoid Transponder. The transponder can then be analysed at a research bench and it will unlock a quest. Accepting the quest will summon an orbiting mechanoid ship to crash land on your tile, which will, finally, allow you to defeat the combat mechs that exit from the ship, claim the Mechanator corpse, yank the chip from its head, jam it in one of your own colonists, and boom, you've got a Mechanator. That's a lot of steps. I also had no idea that colonists just had straight up chip sockets in the back of their heads for tech like this. This isn't the only way, however. Occasionally you might be notified of a site on the world map called a Mechanator Complex. This will have a host of hostile mechanoids guarding it, but it does contain a corpse with a chip to take for yourself. A few things worth considering when designating the Mechanator in your colony is that they will be expected to perform maintenance and work on their own creations. So ideally you want someone with a passion in crafting to help support their smithing skill development. While psychic sensitivity doesn't have an impact necessarily on the Mechanator, psychically deaf pawns are unable to make use of an installed mech link. Their brain just works differently, or rather, doesn't work. Pawns that are also incapable of social will have to summon threats via a gizmo on their bar, rather than from a comms console, but this is less of an issue and more of just a strange interaction. They're fine talking, just not over the phone. Same. So what do you get with Mechanators? You have 4 levels of tech which is specific to them, with each progressive level locked behind an increasingly difficult to obtain tech chip. So once you get your first Mechanator, you unlock basic Mechtech. This in turn unlocks you some new structures, your first production line mechs, and the supporting gear for your Mechanator to wear. Well worth saying up front, Mechanators aren't cheap. You'll be burning through steel, plasteel, components, advanced components, power usage, as well as having to generate new items from this expansion. Waste packs, subcores, but we'll cover waste and pollution after this section ends and talk about subcores a little later. For now, let's focus on Metal Boys. Basic Mechtech gives you the foundation to work from, with the buildings of a Gestator, subcore encoder, recharger, and a band node. Your Gestator is where you can build small-sized mechs.
What is my purpose?
You pass butter.
Oh my god.
This building handles the difficult process of constructing the mechanoids for you after being fed the raw materials that it needs. Basic mechs will need steel and an item called a basic subcore, which can be produced at the subcore encoder, combining steel and components to make the basis of a persona for a mechanoid. Whilst all mechanoids do have the ability to recharge themselves by entering a dormant state, this is a trickle charge at best, so you'll likely want some rechargers around that your mechanoids can plug into. This allows them to quickly top up their internal battery. The final building, the band node, improves a Mechanator's band width. So now that we know these basic structures, what the heck are all the Mechanator buttons for? A basic mech link in a pawn's brain gives them 6 bandwidth and 2 control groups. These are used to control your mechanoids. It limits how many the Mechanator can simultaneously control before potentially losing influence over them. All mechs cost an amount of bandwidth, with larger mechs typically costing more. The basic mechs are all really easy to handle, so that 6 bandwidth will translate nice and easily over into handling 6 mechanoids, which can then be split over 2 control groups. So why use control groups? Simple, you'll likely want some diversity to your mechanoid friends. This allows you to easily structure how they act when acting autonomously. For example, you might want 2 bots to haul and 4 to help you in combat. The 4 combat mechanoids are wasting their battery if they're walking around all day. It isn't necessary. They can be placed into group 2 and set to recharge behaviour. They'll top themselves up to a full battery and then stay dormant, until you tell them to escort you. Meanwhile, the 2 hauler bots have been left in Control Group 1, set to work and just left to it. You have some finer control within this group too, like telling the mechanoids in that group at what point they should go and try to recharge, and just how much they should try and refill their battery too. As with all entities in Rimworld, mechanoids can also be restricted to specific areas, but this isn't group specific, so feel free to knock yourself out making very exact work areas to stop them wandering halfway across the map to try and do the smallest of tasks. The other point to mention with mechanoids is that whilst they can be drafted, they are limited in their movement range. They'll need to move to areas that are close to the Mechanator, so for combat scenarios you'll want the Mechanator around the combat zone, whilst not necessarily waltzing into the thick of an engagement, as the last thing you want is them getting straight out murdered and causing all of your mechanoids to eventually go feral because their master died. Ideally, they'll be tucked behind a solid wall that allows the mechs to engage on the other side of it. So, now we know the buildings and what the Mechanator has access to mechanically. What actual mechanoids do we have? With basic, you'll have the Agrihand, Clean Sweeper, Constructoid, Lifter, and the Militor. All of these are pretty specific in what they do, with it being kind of telegraphed in their naming conventions too. Going forward, it's safe to assume that all mechanoids are immune to fire, extreme temperatures, and all forms of toxic. They don't need to eat, sleep, or recreate. The only thing they need is to charge their battery. Like hostile mechanoids, friendlies can be stunned by EMP and will eventually adapt to it after repeated exposure. This allows you to do some silly bollock shenanigans like adapting them before they enter combat, meaning that you can then throw EMP grenades repeatedly into the middle of the combat area, potentially breaking enemy shields or stunning enemy mechs whilst your own can shrug it off. This adaptation effect does eventually wear off however, so this may not be the most reliable tactic. The Agrihand is a helpful farmer. Whilst their planting skill is technically 10, they have penalties to plant work speed and global work speed, resulting in them working about 1/3 the speed of a pawn with an equal skill. This is obviously offset by the fact that they just keep working until their battery craps out. The Clean Sweeper does the worst job in the colony for you. Much like the Agrihand, they have a work speed debuff, but let's face it, they're cleaning all day. That work speed penalty isn't exactly crippling them. They're very handy for keeping all of your workstations and hospitals squeaky clean. The Constructoid is a useful builder bot. Much like the Agrihand, they have a skill of 10 in their profession, but they have an even worse work speed penalty, with base construction speed and global work speed suffering a hit, resulting in the final work speed being only around 20% the speed of a human with equal proficiency. They're still fantastic for large walling projects however, as with only a couple of Constructoids working in tandem, they'll rapidly get your defences established, letting you decommission them afterwards and repurpose their parts into a different mechanoid instead. Once you've got a few of your own builders over the skill level of 10, you're unlikely to want these around anymore. They're a great help for getting your early game colony set up though. The Lifter is the little helper that makes everything run buttery smooth. Whilst they aren't exactly speedy, they're insanely useful to help with hauling mining yields back to the base or tidying up in workshops, allowing your crafters to drop produce on the floor and just keep working, while the little hauler bot takes the produced items to the correct storage. It's hard to state just how much easier everything flows when these fellas are doing all the heavy lifting for you. Quite literally. Finally, at this tech level you have the Militor, your first step towards combat mech. Not only will you be able to build and use these yourself, you'll also find them arriving with mech raids as a threat whilst using Biotech. Outfitted with an extremely short range shotgun, these guys are great for stun locking individual targets. Their shooting skill is equal to a pawn with level 8, which combined with their extremely limited range means they're surprisingly effective at hitting their target reliably. Thanks to their immunities, they're also fantastic to bait flame breaths from imps, or try and encourage any raiders that come in carrying explosives to perform a little bit of friendly fire. Don't be afraid to throw Militars right into the thick of combat. You can patch them up for free after an engagement is over, and if they happen to get a little bit more blown up, they're cheap as chips to restore in the gestation pod. It's far better for your militars to soak and tank all of that damage rather than any of your colonists.
Protocol 3. Protect the pilot.
BT, what are you doing?
Trust me.
The last few bits at this level of tech are the Airwire headset and the control pack, a piece of headgear and a utility item. The headset increases the bandwidth of the Mechanitor by 3, and the control pack adds an additional control group. Nice little bonuses for the early game to help further expand your mechanical ranks. So how do we advance to the next level of Mechtech then? You'll need a comms console to be able to summon in a mechanoid threat called a Diabolus, which in turn will drop a chip that can unlock the next tier of mechanoid research. This makes advancing with a Mechanitor more like a traditional video game quest than your normal Rimworld progression, with research locked behind beating a boss. Summoning the Diabolus isn't something that you should take lightly. It lands with a few supporting mechs and does have a few tricks of its own, including an incendiary AoE, a fairly heavily telegraphed Hellsphere cannon shot that deals unique vaporized damage, and the mech also features a charge blaster turret that occasionally throws out single shots and can fire while moving. As with most mechs, EMP and melee are highly effective, but you're unlikely to want your Mechanator themselves getting into a brawl with this thing because of the risks that it poses. If you're able to take it down, you'll find that it drops a signal chip, which can be analysed at a research bench to unlock Standard Mechtech, the next tier. Standard Mechtech will unlock some additional buildings, components, equipment, and mechs for you to play with. So what do we got? For new buildings, we have the large mech gestator, which works the same as a normal gestator, but for larger mechs. Unlike the smaller version though, some creations at this station will require multiple cycles to create, meaning longer creation times and more trips to the workshop for your Mechanator to make sure everything is working correctly before flicking the switch and starting the next cycle. To go with the large gestator, you've also got the large recharger. Large mechs will use large chargers, because everything was designed with specific plugs in mind to push competitors out of the market and overcharge consumers for crappy charging cables that break constantly. The subcore soft scanner is what you'll need to make the next step up in mechanoids, creating a new component of a standard subcore, which is more impressive than your basic version. As larger mechs are more complex, they require a more involved subcore, and making more involved subcores is going to need more than components and steel. Now you need to scan a pawn's brain to make a sub-persona that's capable of more complex thoughts.
Eat the pudding, 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 eat the pudding. Okay.
Whilst having your brain scanned to help in producing a standard subcore isn't a harmful process, it isn't exactly beneficial either. Leaving the pawn that was scanned groggy for 4 days, suffering lowered consciousness, manipulation, movement, mood, and potentially causing them to barf occasionally. The pawn that's scanned, however, can be anyone that you're able to get into the chair. Prisoners, slaves, your own colonists, it doesn't matter if they're smart or if they invested in NFTs, the subcore will always come out with the same quality. The final building included is the mech band antenna. Unlike summoning the Diabolus, which only needed a comms console, you'll need to build this antenna every time you want to summon the standard Mechtech's boss, as it'll burn out once it's used, turning into a pile of scrap. Let's not cover that boss just yet though, we've still got the gear and mechs first. You'll have access to 2 new helmets and 1 extra utility item. The bandwidth pack is the utility item. Living up to its name, it increases bandwidth by 9, so if you weren't getting much use out of your extra control group with the previous tier's utility item, this might be more your speed. The 2 helmets are the Array headset and the Mech Commander headset, with both increasing bandwidth by 6, but there's a pretty big difference in what purpose they serve and how expensive they are to make. The Array headset offers no defensive properties, nor insulation, but only costs steel and components to make. A Mech Commander headset has defensive properties, around the same level as a flak helmet, making your Mechanator far less likely to be utterly brained in combat. However, it uses plasteel, components, and needs a signal chip, the same one that you analyse to get this tier of tech. So to produce more than 1 item that requires these, you're going to need to face another Diabolus and yoink its chip. Now, it's not only external gear that you unlock with this tier either. You also gain access to make the standard control sublink and the mech gestation processor implants. Both of these go into the Mechanitor's brain, and you're about to question exactly how much empty space your Mechanitor had inside their head. Both of these implants are also using signal chips and components, so again, you'll need to summon a lot of Diabolus threats in to get the necessary materials. The standard control sublink increases the Mechanitor's control groups by 1, and improves all of their controlled mech's work speed by 6%, which goes some way in explaining why Mechanoid's base work speed is so low. They essentially progress in quality alongside the Mechanitor. Up to 3 of these standard control sublinks can be installed. The mech gestation processor boosts gestation speed by 33% for each one installed, capping out at a 200% bonus with a max of 6 installed. Whilst you're likely to want more efficient worker bots before you go about speeding up how fast they're made, this can be extremely handy after a particularly brutal fight when you need to reform your ranks. Both of these implants don't require doctors to install, they're plug and play. A fully upgraded Mechanitor shaking their head must sound like someone dropping a box of Lego down the stairs. So, the mechs for this tier. You'll already know 2 from vanilla Rimworld. You're able to make your own pikemen and scythers, so you've got some solid choices for long range support and a melee wall. If you want to run them alongside your militars so you've still got a short range option within your combat group, that's up to you. The militars may be outclassed by these mechs, but the stagger from their shotgun can still come in handy to stop your front line from being washed over by a horde of enemies. But by the same token, if you were to get rid of the militars, you could just make a wider and deeper front line, so being overrun was less likely anyway. What you will notice with these mechs is that they're now taking more than 1 bandwidth per unit, with both of them costing 2 to control. Next we have a new type of combat mech, the Scorcher, which you might also see appearing as a hostile mechanoid during raids. Only costing 1 bandwidth despite how they're being made at a large gestator, the Scorcher is somewhat more limited in its combat capabilities, relying on burning enemies to death rather than traditional pew pew or stab stab. Against certain opponents this can be highly effective, whereas for some xenotypes, like imps, they're simply going to shrug this damage off. Fortunately, if you're using a front line of scythers, it's very safe to have a Scorcher helping them out as all of your mechs are immune to fire. This also opens up an opportunity of having an indoor kill box eventually become an indoor cook box as enough bodies begin to go up in flames. Human raiders won't want to hang around for long when breathing burns their lungs. Finally at this tier you've got the Tunneler, your utility mech for mining. These mechs are quite expensive to run. They take up 3 bandwidth and have a hefty part cost. If you thought, aha, but they'll pay for themselves working at the deep drill, sadly not. Whilst they are miners, they only interact with above ground resources. The major upside of a Tunneler mechanoid is that they are perfectly made for purpose, with an effective skill of 10 and a buff to global work speed, unlike most other mech's penalties. These guys will absolutely fly through their tasks. We all know the drill now then. This time you're going to use the antenna to summon the quest threat, and it's going to be a War Queen. The Queen fights with less direct damage than the Diabolus, but it's still equipped with a blaster turret. It's now also sporting a built-in gestation chamber and shield rather than heavy weaponry. War Queens will plop out smaller mechs called War Urchins, small ball-shaped drones that use incredibly short-range spiner guns. The Queen arrives with 600 steel in her belly to create these mechanoids, with them only costing 25 and her being able to support up to 3 at a time, meaning if you try and work your way through all of them, you'll be fighting for a very long time. Fortunately, if the War Queen is killed, it also disables all of the urchins too, so you need to run the fine balance between not being picked apart by her adds, while still focusing the boss enough so that you aren't staying in combat for far too long, whilst dealing with every minor threat that appears. Once defeated, she will drop a power focused chip. Now we're getting places. High Mechtech. Once again, new buildings, resources, mechs and gear to play with. The Subcore Rip Scanner is a new building that you'll need to fabricate your new resource, the High Subcore. As its appearance and name suggests, this is a significantly more painful process than simply having your brain scanned. This instead drills probes into the pawn's body and kind of makes them a bit dead.
Oh no, my brains.
As such, you'll almost exclusively want to use this on prisoners, unless one of your own pawns does something really stupid like has a tantrum and smashes a full stack of advanced components. You get a new building that's a little bit different now, the Mech Booster. These buildings increase the global work speed and movement speed of mechs within their AoE. This effect, unfortunately, doesn't stack. Whilst it may not exactly be cheap to completely cover your base with these, and they consume 200 power each, it can be highly beneficial to place them at busy locations or tuck them behind a wall near your defensive position, as it'll allow your mechs to get in and out of combat just that little bit easier. The next building at this tier is the Mech Band Dish, and as you may have guessed by how this section is formatted now, this is the building that summons the next boss. Just like the antenna, this will burn out after use. This makes the higher tier bosses and their chips progressively more expensive as you go, so whilst it's easy to keep calling in a Diabolus for their signal chips, you really want to consider what you're spending the bigger threats drops to build, as it isn't a free summon. Now we've got new gear. Again, the integrator headset increases bandwidth by 9, whilst offering no protection whatsoever. You don't have an armoured alternative at this tier either, so you'll need to decide if you want the extra bandwidth or the armour that the Mech Commander helmet offers from standard Mechtech. Onto the implants. Now you've got the High Control Sublink, Remote Repairer and the Remote Shielder. The High Control Sublink is what you'll install once you've finished all 3 standard Control Sublink modules, allowing you to stack the work speed buff an additional 3 times, making it 6 in total. Whilst this does also provide extra control groups, at max rank it will be 8, which is serious overkill. The Remote Repairer allows the Mechanitor to repair targets from a distance, provided they have a line of sight to cast the ability. This then allows the Mechanitor to duck back behind cover and maintain the repair, whilst disabling the mechanoid from doing anything other than moving until repairs are either cancelled or completed. Up to 3 of these can be installed, which increases the range of the repair by 6 for each installed module. Whilst it is something very niche, it can be useful to ensure that a target that took a particularly savage blow in the first wave of an attack is brought back to fighting strength for the second, or for quickly restoring a missing limb on a mechanoid that's near useless because of it. As with all mechanoid upgrades, just shove it in your brain box, no need for a doctor. Next is the Remote Shielder, which is a more preventative version of the Remote Repairer, aiming to stop damage before it's even inflicted, rather than fix it after it's already been done. Range and shield energy will increase with the more of these modules you have installed, up to a max of 3. These shields work exactly like a utility shield belt, so they'll stop ranged mechanoids from firing out, meaning that for probably quite a large portion of your mechanoid army, this is going to hamper rather than help. However, this is ideal to throw on the Scyther that's the tip of your spear, baiting all of the enemy fire whilst charging in, allowing it to mitigate some of the damage that would otherwise have potentially taken down a combatant or two before you managed to collide into the enemy. You'll have noticed that we had no new gestator size at this level, so all of these mechs are made with the ones that you already have. A few of the mechs you'll know from vanilla again, the Centipede Burner, the Centipede Gunner, and the Lancer. They're all pretty expensive to use and maintain, with Centipedes eating up 4 bandwidth and the Lancer using 3. Obviously, these offer a great degree of flexibility and, in the case of Centipedes, durability to your combat force. So whilst yes, you could have 4 Militars for the bandwidth of 1 Centipede, that Centipede is going to stand its ground far longer than all of those Militars will. The other combat mechanoid at this tier is the Diabolus. That's right, the boss mech. It's all yours. And you'll know from facing them and seeing them in action that they are very slow and tanky. It gives you access to its Hellsphere cannon and an incendiary burst, which makes it a highly adaptable unit that can deal with any threat. As you'd expect, you're going to pay for this kind of power, with it eating up 5 bandwidth, needing a massive amount of steel, plasteel, a high subcore, and 2 signal chips to make, so you'll need to kill at least 2 Diabolus to create your own. And now it's probably a good time to mention, each time you summon a boss, they turn up with more bodyguards. So if you've been summoning Diabolus threats to upgrade your Mechanitor with new gear and implants, you've likely already hit the highest threat level that they can land with, making it a much greater risk to try and farm for all of these chips. The last 2 mechs at this tier will round out your workforce. The Fabricor gives you access to a Mechanoid Crafter, costing only a single bandwidth. These mechs are ideal candidates for the benefits of the Mech Booster, as they'll be standing stationary to do smithing, tailoring, crafting, and interestingly, cooking jobs. As you'd expect for these workers, they have a skill level of 10 and suffer a work speed penalty of 50%, so they're unlikely to be churning out reliably high quality gear, but they do a fantastic job to manage component assembly or smelting operations, allowing you easier access to just continue vomiting out more mechanoids. Because of how happily these guys will just work come rain or shine, it also opens up possibilities to start repurposing raider gear into steel by smelting all of it. Normally this can be a bit of a pain in the ass because it distracts crafters away from important tasks where they could be putting their higher skill to use, but for a Fabricor, they'll get through most of the work that you give them so quickly you'll need to find something to occupy their time. This is an ideal use. Then there's the Paramedic. If you're doing a solo Mechanator run, unlocking this guy is going to be amazing. Finally no more self-tending and nearly dying because of illnesses. Like other worker bots, they only need 1 bandwidth, they have a medical skill of 10 and a global work speed of 50%, so whilst they may not patch up pawns very quickly, they do allow you to potentially save the colony doctor when they take a particularly bad hit and can't patch themselves up. Again, for a solo Mechanator run, this is likely to be the only way that you'll be able to install more exotic modifications for your pawn, like giving them bionic limbs, or even Architect if you manage to pick some up. Unlike a lot of other mechs too, the Paramedic comes with some abilities. It has the ability to jump a short distance, which is useful for crossing large areas of movement impacting terrain to help a casualty, and they're also fitted with a small fire foam popper. Not quite sure where it is though. This allows them to rescue colonists from burning buildings with ease, quickly taking care of 2 emergencies by putting out a fire, and saving whoever was stupid or unlucky enough to be caught within it. Both of these abilities are just a simple cooldown too. They don't need refueling with any resources to work again. Really easy to keep one of these around on standby at all times in case of emergency. Eventually you're going to use the mech band dish and summon the final boss, the Apocryton. They use a toxic needle gun, resurrect their fallen escorts, try to cause mental breaks amongst your colonists with a psychic drone that gets more intense the closer you are, and they can leap away from combat when engaged in melee. They boast the highest armor and the largest health pool, as well as coming in equipped with a shield. Unlike other large mechanoid threats, Apocrytons are surprisingly average in size, which makes them harder to hit for your ranged combatants as you won't have an accuracy buff, like when fighting against the Diabolus or a War Queen. Unlike facing the War Queen when you were trying to get the boss down and ignoring the adds, if you ignore the adds against an Apocryton, they're likely to be far more dangerous. Unfortunately, when you defeat the adds, it'll try to resurrect them. The fight is going to be a slog, trying to burn through all of its resurrection charges until it's the only thing left on the field, as by itself it isn't a huge threat, even if its toxic weapon can be a little bit scary. You'll need to be careful using a lot of your own mechanoids to defeat this boss too, as upon death it'll explode with a huge EMP burst, stunning both friendly and hostile mechanoids. Depending on the placement of this AoE going off, it may take out all of your defensive forces while still leaving some attackers able to engage, so make sure you're keeping your units back so they aren't all locked down. Once this fight is over, you can claim your prize, the Nano Structuring Chip, used to unlock the final tier, Ultra Mechtech. The final stage doesn't unlock any new structures, but it does bring some amazing gear and the biggest and best mechanoids you can field. For gear, you have the Mech Lord helmet and suit, as well as the Repair Probe implant. The implant works just like the others, stacking up to 6 times and increasing repair speed by 33% for each one. These implants are incredibly expensive to make however, so whilst it might be useful to have rapid repairs available, potentially at range too if you're combining it with the remote repairer, there are much better things you could use the component parts on. Say for example, the Mech Lord armor set. You won't have nearly enough chips after beating the Apocryton just once, unfortunately, with the helmet and armor each needing 2 nanostructuring chips. So if you want this as early as possible, you'll have to beat the thing 4 times, without spending any of the chips on upgrades to your forces. Not an easy ask. As you'd expect from the cost and the naming of this gear, this is the tippy top of the potential Mechanitor equipment, providing a solid amount of armor, insulation, and offering the highest increases to your Mechanitor's stats. The helmet increases bandwidth by a whopping 12, as does the armor. Whilst they both come with debuffs to the wearer's combat stats, lowering ranged and melee accuracy, I don't think you really need your Mechanitor in combat when they're able to field 24 extra bandwidth worth of friendly mechanoids, especially when you see what mechs you're able to use at the highest tech level. The Centipede Blaster is the last of the vanilla mechs that you unlock. Combining its hefty durability with a more reliable weapon than the previous 2 iterations, still taking 4 bandwidth, so realistically you want to swap all of your gunners over to these. Whilst you could maybe keep a burner for shits and giggles, I'd personally use a blaster for its reliability over incendiary weapons. Next you have a mech known as the Centurion. It's extremely heavy, using 5 bandwidth, for good reason. Centurions are walking shields, projecting a protective dome that stops any low-level hostile projectiles from entering, with its shield able to absorb up to 300 damage before breaking, and regenerating at around 1 HP every 2 seconds. This is very much here to stop that initial wave of damage from crashing against your forces. It's not something that's going to remain for an entire fight and negate all damage entirely. As with all shields, it's especially vulnerable to EMP, so you want to make sure that any threats that turn up with grenades are swiftly dealt with, otherwise they'll strip away potentially hundreds of points of damage absorption. Once this shield is removed, it isn't harmless however. It still packs a charge blaster similar to a Diabolus, so it can fire whilst moving, being able to pick off targets as it sluggishly crawls along the battlefield. Now comes the part where I tell you these mechs also turn up as enemies too, so bringing EMP to later mech encounters is definitely a recommendation, rather than trying to get through 300 HP of shield. Next is the Legionary. A smaller mechanoid in terms of bandwidth, only costing 2, it still needs to be produced in a large gestator, as it has quite a nifty setup. Legionaries come with a small shield, not as large in coverage or as strong as the Centurion, but operating under the same rules, allowing friendly projectiles to pass through whilst blocking enemy attacks. This allows you to reinforce your front line with Legionaries, overlapping their shields with the melee whilst using their shorter ranged weapons to provide supporting fire. Then, when the Legionary shields are broken, a Centurion can move down to provide their shield as replacement cover, whilst remaining further behind the front line. Again, these are a mechanoid that you will see turning up as an enemy, and their shields are equally as vulnerable to EMP. So if you're playing with Biotech, and even if you're not using a Mechanator, you're likely going to want an EMP grenade launcher on a shelf in the base somewhere, for any time mech raids land on your doorstep. It's even more valuable than it was in base game Rimworld. Now we have the Tesseron. Using 3 bandwidth, these mechanoids fill a similar role to a Lancer, only they need to get a bit closer to the fight and they have a sweeping beam grazer weapon. This has a chance to set any target hit by it on fire, and can be devastatingly effective against enemies like insects or tribals, as they have very little burn protection. A Tesseron's weakness, however, is melee, as they have a minimum range that they can fire from, and locking them down in close quarters will see them struggle to fight back. You'll want to learn how to deal with them too, as they're going to be turning up as enemies and they absolutely love to punish players that keep their units formed up in a line, making your pawns run around on fire whilst other mechs that came with them do the damage to finish the job. Lethal efficiency is what they do best. And finally, another boss you can build yourself, the War Queen. Working just like the enemy that you'll have likely killed a dozen or so times to get here, they're the most durable mechanoid that the player can make. The main risk with using your own War Queen is the steel you're going to be churning through to produce the war urchins. They're absolutely perfect fodder to bait out large enemy attacks like rocket launchers, or to try and pull attention away from your larger, more dangerous mechs as they're trying to get into position. And that is the Mechanitor. But that isn't everything that comes with them, because if you're going to use all of these mechs and keep recharging them, you'll quickly realise a problem that you'll have to deal with: waste packs and pollution. The final section of this video is going to go over all of the new mechanics around pollution and toxic, which you likely said, wait, what does that do? Over an hour ago when I mentioned wasters that have pollution stimulus. Certain buildings and processes now produce waste packs, or generate pollution. This then falls in with the final bits of biotech research: the toxifier generator, tox gas, waste pack atomizer, and toxic filtration projects. Waste packs as an item will need to be kept frozen and under a solid roof, otherwise they slowly begin to deteriorate. When a waste pack finally degrades, they explode in a little toxic fart and pollute the tile that they're on. If the tile that they're located on is already polluted, they instead affect an unpolluted adjacent tile, slowly spreading their impact across the land. These waste packs are generated when mechs are gestated or recharged. You may also be able to accept quests where you'll be rewarded for letting another faction dump a bunch of waste packs on your tile, making them your problem to deal with.
I think it's full, sir.
That's ridiculous! The last tree held 9 drums!
So what does pollution do? Impacted tiles will show up in red with the pollution overlay turned on. It turns soil into polluted soil, where you can only grow the new food of the Toxy Potato, Devil Strand, Psychoid, and some very dead looking trees. The majority of xenotypes will receive toxic buildup while existing in polluted tiles, similarly to when you're caught out in a toxic rain. Wasters and insects on the other hand have pollution stimulus, which means they see a movement speed buff and a consciousness buff from spending time in a polluted area. They absolutely love living in a base that's filled with it, whilst most other xenotypes will fall over and expire from continued exposure. If you want to purposefully fill your base with pollution, you don't need to rely on waste packs either. You can use the toxifier generator to produce your electricity, and this will slowly pollute the land around it as it works, impacting 6 tiles every 3 days. Eventually, once the toxifier generator has reached the very edge of its pollution range, it'll shut down, meaning you need to place new ones in an area that isn't polluted and start the process all over again. So that's how we make pollution, but how do we fix it? You've got a few options. Your pawns are able to manually clean polluted tiles, bagging it up into a waste pack. These waste packs can then be kept frozen in a storage room, which isn't exactly a great solution, more of an out of sight, out of mind kind of thing, but it does make your map safe to traverse again. Rather than cleaning it manually, you could instead build a pollution pump, which actually cleans the area around it, despite sounding like it does the opposite. As long as this device is powered, it'll automate the process of cleaning pollution in the area of effect for your colony, saving you time and labour. Finally, you might rarely come across something called a Pollux seed, or even a Pollux tree. These feed on nearby pollution and can clean the surrounding area, allowing you to place small stockpiles of waste packs at the base of it, so when they expire and release pollution, it feeds the tree and removes the packs from your map permanently. 2 of these processes I just mentioned make waste packs though. Can we seriously not do anything about that? Fortunately we can, with a horrifically expensive piece of tech called the Waste Pack Atomizer. You'll need to have gotten to the stage of acquiring nanostructuring chips from Mechanitor bosses to build these. They are one of the only reliable ways you'll be able to permanently get rid of waste packs off your map, however. They're able to atomize 2 waste packs per day, so it slowly allows you to clear your storage by safely destroying the waste packs without any consequences. As I'm sure many of you have already thought, I don't need to store these waste packs though, I'll just throw them away. Well, yes you can. You can launch them in a transport pod or simply caravan them off map and dump them into the wilderness. But much like guards in Bethesda games, everyone in the world somehow knows that you're the one responsible for it. It causes diplomatic penalties that scale in severity based on how much crap you decided to throw away. For a clean energy setup using these buildings, the ratio is 6-3-1. You want 6 generators to 3 pumps to 1 atomizer. This provides a net gain of 7,400 watts of power. So whilst it's not cheap to set up, pollution does have a way of making you Finally, worth noting about pollution is that its presence is going to increase the occurrence of the acidic smog weather effect. It doesn't even have to be on your tile. Simply living near a polluted tile will occasionally see clouds of it floating over your settlement. It lowers light levels, really hampers plant growth, and ruins the durability of any items that you left unroofed or outdoors whilst it's in effect. It'll also upset any colonists that aren't immune to toxic. Then you've got the items that don't necessarily play with this pollution, but instead with the effect of toxic. This can come in 2 forms: toxic gas and toxic buildup. Toxic gas is a roided up pepper spray, causing pain and inflicting sight and breathing debuffs on anyone caught inside it without an immunity to toxic. Toxic gas exposure will rise and fall quite rapidly between mild, moderate and severe, and whilst it's being applied, the far more dangerous effect of toxic buildup will also be happening, with this taking significantly longer to disperse. Toxic buildup is also the effect that occurs for most pawns living on polluted tiles and typically takes a good amount of time to progress. However, toxic weapons and gases drastically accelerate this and can turn a healthy pawn into a goopy corpse in less than a minute of exposure. Toxic buildup is a scaling debuff, with 5% consciousness loss at initial, 10% at minor, 15 at moderate with a small potential of vomiting, carcinomas or dementia being applied. At serious, consciousness is lowered by 25% with even more risk of those conditions. At extreme severity, a pawn will fall unconscious, with all of those conditions at the highest risk of occurring. If toxic buildup ever hits 100%, the pawn dies, and their body immediately becomes desiccated, and not like the coconut. As you might expect from this, raiders that use toxic weapons are extremely dangerous, as having one of your own pawns fall unconscious in these clouds likely means you won't be able to get them away in time to stop that toxic buildup hitting 100%. Equally, if you're playing as wasters, you don't need to look at human raids of, I need to kill X amount to make these guys flee. It's more a matter of, I need to hold them in place for 30 seconds while this magic gas does its work. Overwhelming numbers don't matter when the gas hits everyone inside of it. For weaponry using toxic, you'll have shells that can be fired from a mortar or used as an IED, grenades that can either be thrown from a belt or fired from a tox bomb launcher, similar to an EMP grenade or an EMP launcher. You typically get more range from the launcher with a faster wind-up, cooldown and accuracy on a handheld grenade. There's also a utility belt option called a tox pack, which releases a steady cloud of gas around the user and costs chem fuel to refill. Just a single one of these on a melee pawn can be fantastic to choke attackers and ruin their accuracy, all whilst additionally lowering their consciousness, making it easier for you to just wail on them. To counteract these kind of effects, you do get a couple of new bits of equipment and some new modifications. Pawns can wear either a face mask or a gas mask to increase their resistance to toxic environments, because despite what people on the internet said a few years ago, masks do work. It's why certain professions have worn them for fucking years. You'll find that if you're living in a polluted tile, caravans and some raids will start to turn up wearing them as well, knowing that they're going to have to fight you in an utter shithole. This can make it a little trickier to bring people down with your toxic shenanigans, as they're likely 50% more resistant to it now. If you want to install some new parts, you could install a detoxifier lung, which provides a small bonus to breathing and increases toxic environment resistance by 60%, so a full set will see a pawn completely immune to toxic buildup, toxic fallout, toxic gas, pollution, rot stink, acidic smog, asthma, and lung rot, which is a pretty solid chunk of risks to remove for a couple of implants. Next you have the option of detoxifier kidneys. These increase the user's blood filtration, which will see a buff to immunity gain speed. The kidneys also increase toxic resistance by 50%, so a pair will provide immunity to toxic effects. Now is the big difference between toxic environment and straight toxic resistance. A small thing, but important. The kidneys will be able to protect from direct toxic attacks, as they offer flat resistance, whereas the lungs are only protecting from environmental effects. So pawns with a pair of detoxifier lungs, shot by an Apocryton toxic gun, will still experience build-up. A pawn with a pair of kidneys, however, will not. The kidneys also won't provide some of the same protections, like lung rot, but they can, however, prevent chemical damage from occurring if your pawns are taking fat lines of yayo with their morning coffee. The last part to mention around pollution is that when living on a polluted tile, you're also likely to see a new form of infestation event, where insects push cocoons to the surface of some polluted land and spring to action if a pawn wanders too close to them. This can be beneficial in some locations, as they're likely to trigger when a raider passes by and thus thin their numbers for you. Or it can be really annoying when they spawn right next to where you were using your deep drills, meaning you have to deal with a bunch of pollution stimulated bugs before you continue collecting your resources. Oh, another final part to mention, there's a waste rat and a toxalope now. If you live in a polluted area, the rats become gross and their bite inflicts toxic damage, with the boomalopes becoming walking sacks of miasma. Nothing too crazy, but I knew that if I didn't mention it, someone would comment and say. And that is Biotech. Pretty sure it's easy to tell why this is hands down the easiest recommendation for the first DLC to buy, right? All of your raids are now more interesting because of the xenotypes. You've got an entire path of questing that you can do with the Mechanitor, and you'll unlock yourself some cool new tech for the colony. You can raise families, splice genes, make vampires, pollute the world, clean the world, do a solo run, do a generational run, try and collect every gene, try and recruit every xenotype. This DLC adds a larger, more interesting amount of variety to each run than Ideology does, and Ideology is the mod that was made to diversify your runs. Oh, on that topic, with Biotech you also get one new meme for Ideology, blood feeding. This lets you worship Sanguophages. You'll also get supporting presets around blood feeders, child labour and mechanoid labour, so you can use them with other ideologies if you'd like. This video's length compared to the other DLCs kind of speaks for itself. It's just so much content, but it never feels bloated. It doesn't play like mechanics were put in place simply for the sake of having them or to try and artificially inflate the game's runtime. It comes across like there was a goal in mind with what they wanted to add, and then they walked backwards to fill in the gaps between it, so that everything still fits with the original game. You wanted vampires? Well, we should make other xenotypes too. How about a gene system? Even better, how about pawns that are able to pass on their genes to kids? You want to control mechs? Okay, well we shouldn't have it all available from the start though. How about we make a progression? They can get new gear and they can work through challenges. You're right, that does sound like we're also adding quite a lot of industrialization to this. We should add pollution to make it more thematic. And instead of just making pollution a negative, we should make it a potential positive as well. You can almost see the whiteboard of ideas with the red string and the circles tying everything together. This is a complete package. Royalty might be a little bit too specific for some players. Ideology is a framework that you get to play with, but not that much else. Anomaly is more of a standalone expansion pack than an integrated DLC. Biotech is just the best of Rimworld. You wouldn't want to go back to plain old Rimworld after using it. It's simply that good. If you're enjoying content like this, drop a like and don't forget to subscribe or comment, all that algorithm stuff. If you'd like to support me further, a link to Patreon is included in the description. You can name your own price and the supporter tier starts from just £1 a month. It gets your name in the credits for videos like this. Thanks for watching folks. If you have any mods you'd like to see a full breakdown for or suggestions of mods you'd like to see covered, feel free to leave them in the comments, I might get around to them. I'll be back again soon with another Rimworld mod rundown. Wherever you are in the world, enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon or evening. Take care. My voice is fucked.